Welcome to our Nightmare Survivors, a place where the most chilling tales of the night come alive. Here, we bring you nightmare stories shared by real people, those who have faced the darkness and lived to tell their tales. Each story takes you deep into the eerie, mysterious world of the unknown, where fears take shape, shadows move, and survival becomes a triumph. From haunted dreams to encounters with the supernatural, we explore every corner of the human experience with nightmares. These are more than just stories. They're journeys through terror, resilience, and the unexplainable. If you love diving into the spine-chilling and thought-provoking, you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button to become a part of our growing community of thrill seekers and story lovers. And don't stop there. Share your own nightmare experiences in the comments or through our page. Your story could be the next one we feature. Together, let's uncover the mysteries of the night. Subscribe now, and don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell to never miss a story. Let's turn the fear of the night into a journey we take together. I want to give my first-hand account of the events that occurred on my family's property in the spring of 2016. Before I begin, I would like to provide some minor details about myself. My name is Tanner, and I am 28 years old, but I was 20 when these events unfolded. Now, with that out of the way, I will continue. My family used to own a decent amount of property in northern New Hampshire, about 200 acres made up of hardwood and softwood forests, along with 3 large open fields spread around the area. There is a hunting cabin on this land, situated in the corner of the southernmost field. The cabin is very secluded, with the closest road being around 8 miles down a narrow dirt path that eventually connects to the main road. This path is just barely large enough to fit a single vehicle. After I remove these less essential details, I will do my best to discuss what happened that spring. Until 2016, my father and I took an annual turkey hunting trip, typically in mid-May. The trip always ran from Friday evening, when we arrived, until Monday morning. I remember when I was still in school, my father would always let me stay home the Monday we'd get back. I missed those days. The time we spent at the cabin was perfect for allowing quality father-son time, which there wasn't much of in those days. Anyway, as usual that year, we arrived at the cabin on Friday, May 13th, at 6:45 p.m. The cabin was nothing special, but it was ours. It had a small front porch and a single wood door that led straight into the main area. The main area was simple. There was a round wood table, 3 chairs, an old green couch that had seen better days, a gun rack hanging on the wall near the doorway that led into a small bunk room, and a small cooking area with a few cabinets and a counter. There weren't many options for when nature called. Just the woods or an old outhouse about 15 yards into the trees behind the cabin. As I said, we arrived at the cabin around 6:45 p.m. that Friday. My father's red Ford F-150 kicking up some dust from the dirt path as we pulled up. The sun was starting to set below the treetops. It was always a little eerie at the cabin when the sun went down. It always felt like someone was watching us from the trees. Go figure. We unpacked our things from the truck bed and went up to the cabin and onto the porch steps. That's when we noticed them. We first discovered 5 large pits that had been dug in the field near the front of the cabin. I recall my father saying something along the lines of, "Those must be some huge moles. He will always make light of things, no matter the situation." The wild thing about these holes is that each one was dug at least 5 feet deep and 7 feet long. They also appeared as though something had spent a lot of time in 1 or 2 of them, almost like sleeping in them. I don't know. It's hard to explain. That, however, wasn't the most bizarre part. What we found next were 3 severed deer legs at the foot of our cabin's front door. My father was quiet for a long moment. All he had to say was a very brief, "Huh." He seemed legitimately disturbed by this, and that made me nervous. We discussed for a few moments why they could be here. A sick prank, a careless hunter, Bigfoot, but ultimately we couldn't settle on a solid explanation. It felt deliberate, though. My father decided to just take the legs a few yards into the trees and toss them. Some free food for the coyotes, he had said. From there, we unpacked the rest of the truck and settled in. The remainder of the evening continued as usual. We organized our hunting gear, ate an easy dinner, set up our bunks, and talked. By 9 p.m., we both decided to turn in, as we had to be up early for the morning hunt. Morning finally came, and my father and I were eager to get into the woods. We got geared up, loaded our 20-gauge shotguns, and headed out. We both had makeshift hunting blinds built years ago, about a quarter-mile apart from each other and a mile and a half from the cabin. Together, we entered the forest to the east. After the mile-and-a-half trek through a stretch of hardwood forest, it was time to split up and make our way to our respective blinds. I recall my father making yet another joke about how he hoped he wouldn't come across any more severed deer legs on his way to his blind. I didn't find this amusing. The whole event from the previous evening still weighed heavily on my mind. I proceeded through the trees and brush for several more minutes, my 20-gauge slung over my shoulder, trying not to think about last night. That's when I stopped in my tracks. I could see the blind, but something felt off. The air smelled unclean, and everything around me had gone silent. There were no birds, noises from nearby wildlife or wind. Nothing. I even found myself holding my breath. I removed my shotgun from my shoulder and slowly moved toward the blind. As I got closer, the smell in the air changed to the distinct stench of death. I've smelled dead animals before, so I instantly recognized it. I opened the door to the blind, and what I found walked the line between grotesque and macabre. Well, let's say, I found the rest of the deer. The doe had 3 legs missing, ripped off at the joints. The hide of her back had been torn off, her face, now disfigured, looked like something had been gnawing on it, and she had multiple lacerations across her body. Most disturbingly, her 4th leg had been broken off like the others, except this one had been crudely shoved down her throat. Whatever had killed this deer wanted her to suffer as much as possible. I remember standing there in complete shock for several moments, contemplating what to do next. Should I remove her from my blind? Should I leave the area and hunt from a different spot? Should I go get my father? I honestly had no clue what to do. I ended up deciding to go and get my father. It didn't take me long to reach him because I ran the entire quarter-mile to his blind. I was by no means in the best shape for a then 20-year-old, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I was completely out of breath when I explained to him what I had just found. My father believed me, of course, and together we briskly made our way back to my blind. The anticipation of showing him the deer was killing me, so you can probably imagine my horror when we arrived, and the fucking deer was gone. My father still believed me, however, especially when we found drag marks on the ground leading from the blind's entrance off into the forest. Oddly enough, the tracks led in the same direction that would eventually take you back to the cabin, a mile and a half away. We immediately decided to return to the cabin, just in case whatever mutilated the deer had gone there. Both my father and I knew something was very wrong. Our shotguns stayed in our arms as we walked back through the hardwood forest. Suddenly, my father said, "Look," and pointed ahead. I followed his gaze and saw that we had picked up the trail of drag marks on the forest floor. We quickened our pace, following the marks the rest of the way until we reached the cabin a short time later. At this point, we knew what we would find. As we neared the front porch, we saw that the corpse of the deer was exactly where we expected it, deliberately placed at the foot of the cabin's front door. My father was beginning to get angry, and I grew increasingly anxious. Without a word, he handed me his shotgun and proceeded to roughly drag the deer's body by its head and neck to the tree line, where he had tossed its legs the evening prior. "Dad, can we just go inside?" I muttered. "I don't really feel like spending time in the woods after all this bullshit. Something isn't right." He agreed, and we headed inside for the remainder of the day. It was a long afternoon. All we did was make small talk and drink Heinekens into the evening. The buzz did help our moods. It was a much better alternative to being out in the woods somewhere with whoever butchered that poor deer. Don't ask me why we didn't just get out of Dodge when we found the deer's body at the cabin. Stubbornness? Denial? Maybe we both felt like things couldn't get worse. I don't have an answer. What does it matter now anyway? Dusk came that Saturday evening. My father had just started cooking dinner, and that's when we heard it. A low, deep squeal mixed with something that sounded like laughter. As strange as it may sound, it was like a large pig was outside the cabin, laughing at us. My father and I moved to one of the cabin's front windows to see if we could locate the source of the laughter, and that's when we saw him. Beyond the field in front of the cabin, standing at the edge of the now darkening treeline, was what I can only describe as an extremely large, naked man. Easily 300+ pounds, with the head of a pig. And no, not like a pig mask or some crude spirit Halloween costume, but the actual head of a pig. He had tusks. His body appeared hairless. He stood bipedal with floppy pig ears and the legs and hooves of a massive pig. The whole 9 yards. I scrambled for my hunting bag to retrieve my binoculars. Once I had him in view, I could see he had very human-like eyes, cold and blank, staring back at us. He wore a long grin stretching across his face, almost from ear to ear. That was the worst part. His smile. I could feel his vile intentions radiating from that smile as I watched through the binoculars. I had to look away. I handed the binoculars to my father so he could see, and his reaction was the same as mine. Disbelief and horror. My father watched as the creature bent down and picked something up from the ground, draping it over his massive shoulders. My father later told me that it appeared to be the deer hide that had been torn from the doe's back. Sick fucking thing, my dad whispered under his breath. The pig man then slowly backed into the trees behind him and was gone. We took this opportunity to pack up our stuff, grab our shotguns, and make a dash for the truck, all while never taking our eyes off the treeline. My father was ahead of me, so he reached the truck before I did. I was just coming down the porch steps when I heard him yell, "What an absolute fucking joke!" When I approached the truck, I saw that all 4 tires had been crudely slashed in multiple places. How did we not notice this? When could this have happened? I gasped, my voice trembling with fear. "I don't know," my dad replied. "Just get back in the cabin." We did just that and hurried back indoors. Once inside, my father locked the door and checked to ensure all the windows were latched. We then sat down at the table, and he explained our plan of action. Unfortunately, we would have to stay the night. It was getting darker, and an 8-mile trek to the main road was simply out of the question. Since the cabin had no electricity, my father said we would get out all of our LED lanterns and set them up around the main area and bunk room. He wanted to place them anywhere with windows so they could also illuminate some of the outside. He then told me that we would stay up all night and sit at the table with our shotguns loaded and close by in case the pigman decided to pay us a visit at any point during the night. I checked my watch. It read 10:01 p.m. A few hours had passed since we had seen the pigman standing at the treeline. I want to make a quick point. No, we didn't have cell phones. We would leave them home every year to avoid distractions during the trip. Besides, there was hardly any service out there anyway. By 11:45 p.m., I rechecked my watch, and still, nothing had happened. I decided to slightly crack a window to see if I could hear anything outside. Once again, it was dead silent out in the woods. There was nothing but a slight breeze, carrying with it that all too familiar unclean smell. Tanner. Now! I awoke to my father shaking me awake and telling me to get up. "What is it?" I groaned while checking my watch. It read 2 a.m. I had fallen asleep at the table, and I guessed my father had allowed me the rest. He, however, had remained awake and vigilant. He silently motioned me to one of the front windows near the door. I slowly got up, moved to where he was standing, and peered out into the dark front area outside of the cabin that was slightly illuminated by a lantern. I glanced around for several moments, unable to see what my father was trying to show me. He repositioned me to exactly where he stood, and then I saw him. The pigman was standing just at the edge of the lantern light. His silhouette was just barely visible. He looked even bigger this close, easily over 7 feet tall. His face was not visible. The 2 white, unblinking dots of his eyes were all that showed in the dark. I knew that the bastard was still smiling. Even in the dark, I could tell. Just like before, he stood there, watching. The worst part is that he was silent. He made no noise at all. My father and I stood in the window for a solid minute, staring back at him, not wanting to give him the satisfaction of backing away first despite our mounting fear. He suddenly and quickly backed away from the lantern's glow, his white, glowing eyes the last to disappear. He remained close this time, however. We could hear him circling the cabin for 25 minutes or so. He began making all kinds of low grunts, squeals, and chuckles. At this point, my father and I had our shotguns in our hands, fully expecting him to charge through the cabin's front door. But he never did, not then anyway. His noises grew fainter and slowly subsided, and all was again silent. We continued to sit at the table, and neither of us said a word. I kept checking my watch. 2:45 a.m., 2:50 a.m., 3 a.m. The time was going by so agonizingly slow that I couldn't take the tension anymore. "Dad, what the hell is the plan here?" I blurted out, standing up from my chair. "We can't just sit around and wait for it to come back." My father just looked at me with a tinge of annoyance on his face. "What would you have us do, Tanner?" he said sharply. "Go running out into the dark, guns blazing? With birdshot, no less. You think that's gonna do shit to this thing?" I stood there for a moment, then sat down. He was right. My dad's face turned soft as he saw I was visibly scared. "Listen, son," he started, "it's important that we—" A sudden loud crash of breaking glass rang out from the bunk room. We grabbed our shotguns and rushed in, my father ahead of me. Once in the bunk room, we saw that the single window on the far wall was smashed, and a softball-sized rock sat on the floor surrounded by shards of glass. We stood there quietly, waiting to see what would happen next. We could hear the pig man outside the window, somewhere in the darkness. He was chuckling to himself. My father, furious, ran to the broken window, stuck the barrel of his shotgun outside, and blindly fired a thunderous shot. The pig man began to laugh and squeal, clearly amused. We heard him rush past the window and around the left side of the cabin. "It's headed for the front door," my father shouted. All I could do was stand there, paralyzed by some primal fear that is likely rooted in the brain of every human being on this earth. My father, however, rushed forward toward the bunk room doorway, trying to make it to the main area before the pigman could gain entry. But just as he reached it, the pigman was violently slamming on the cabin's front door. Still standing where I was, I watched my father quickly step back into the bunk room, slam the door shut, and lock it. Just as he did this, the pigman crashed through the front door, squealing at the top of his lungs. He was inside now. My father continued to back up until he was standing beside me. He turned his head to look at me. He didn't say anything, but I could see in his eyes that he was afraid. Not for himself, but for me. Then, an enormous crashing sound erupted from the main area. It sounded like the table had just been thrown across the room. More crashing, banging, and the sounds of things breaking and being torn off the walls followed. The pigman was trashing the place. We couldn't see much. We had only placed a single lantern in the bunk room, so the lack of visibility, coupled with the chaos ensuing, made our situation worse, especially when we knew what was on the other side of that door. I have never been so scared in my life. When the sounds of destruction finally stopped, we both held our breath. The silence was deafening. Then we heard the pigman slowly make his way to the bunk room door, his hooves making heavy knocking sounds on the cabin's wood flooring. He stopped just on the other side of the door. We could smell his foulness, even from way back in the room. My father and I raised our shotguns and aimed them at the doorway. "The minute that door breaks in, you fire every shell you have," my father said softly. The pig man began to mumble to himself. No discernible words came out, but it almost sounded like a language. Then he let out an incredibly long, drawn-out, high-pitched squeal. The noise gave me immediate goosebumps, and I came very close to dropping my gun to cover my ears. I just wanted it to stop. Finally, he did. He turned from the bunk room door and charged back outside through the shattered front doorway. And all fell silent once again. We waited in the glow of the lantern light for several minutes. Both of us were too shaken to move. My father's voice broke the silence. "I'm gonna check things out." Keeping his aim on the bunk room door, he slowly moved forward. I followed this time. When he reached the door, he kept his shotgun steady in one hand and unlocked the door with the other. With a firm push, it swung open. My father quickly moved into the main area, checking every corner with his shotgun raised. I was close behind him, doing the same, mainly to feel like I was doing something. The cabin was empty. Everything was in disarray. The table was flipped over, and on the other side of the room, the couch was torn to shreds, the cabinets were torn off the wall, the windows were broken, the chairs were scattered, and there were deep tusk marks all over the walls. Together, my father and I flipped the table back over and recentered it in the middle of the room, along with the chairs. There was no fixing the front door. It was in splinters all over the floor. We sat back at the table, and I glanced at my watch, which read 3:20 a.m. That whole ordeal had only been 20 minutes in total. What a joke. There were still a couple of hours until daybreak, and I was petrified by the thought of the pigman coming back for us. But to our surprise, he didn't. We sat at the table with our shotguns, surrounded by the wreckage, until the sun began to peek over the tops of the trees. I walked outside to the porch steps and sat down. I just wanted to take in the warmth from the rising sun for a moment. Seconds later, my father was sitting down beside me. "Tanner," he said, concern in his voice. "Are you all right?" I nodded slowly. "I'm never coming back here," I said. Saying that out loud broke my heart because that land and cabin had been the home of countless memories since my childhood. Hunting trips, weekend family gatherings, hikes, and all kinds of good stuff. But after everything that had happened over the course of that weekend, I knew I'd never be back. My father put his arm around me and gave me a tight, one-armed hug but said nothing. He then stood up. "We better get going. That 8-mile walk is calling our names." That made me smile a bit. "I can't wait," I replied. We packed our things and set out into the field towards the dirt path. As we walked, a high-pitched squeal echoed from the forest and across the field. My father and I exchanged glances and kept walking. The trek to the main road took about 3 hours, but we made it in one piece. We walked the main road until we could flag someone down and have them pull over. The man who pulled over was nice enough to let us use his cell phone to call my mom. And within half an hour, she was there to pick us up. My parents owned the land for another 3 years until 2019, when it finally sold. We never returned to get the truck or fix the cabin. The truck was included in the asking price, and the cabin was as is. We never disclosed what happened that weekend to the realtor, the buyers, or anyone else, which is why I have given so little information about names and exact locations. Should we have disclosed everything or at least tried to? Yes. Did we? No. Would you have? It's been over 8 years, and I've stayed quiet about what happened that spring until now. I have felt an increased urge to share my account these last few months. A big part of me wants to make people aware that there are things in this world that cannot be explained by logic or science, and that there are dark things out there that want to do you harm. So I will leave you with this. If you ever find yourself deep in the forests of New Hampshire, especially up north, I urge you to stay vigilant and please keep an eye on the Treeline because he could be there, watching.